Welcome back to Earth Station Trek, a show where we trek from the early days on NBC to the future on Paramount Plus and everywhere in between. I'm Charles Kelso, and it's my privilege to introduce the Earth Station Trek crew, Alan Seiler.
Hello, everybody.
And Veronica Danschel.
Hi.
And Keith's having network issues tonight. He said he'll be along momentarily. But I mean, tonight I threw out the topic, so I guess I will kick it off. Talking about filler episodes. Because there was an interview a little while back with Alex Kurtzman, and he brought up the subject of filler episodes, and I wanted to read the quote real quick to sort of get this going. And he said, "It's funny. You can talk to old writers of old Trek, and they're like, man, there's a bunch of filler episodes in there. We were just trying to get to 22 episodes a season, and we all know which of those episodes were filler, and we know the ones that were truly stellar from the ones that felt like they were kind of spinning their wheels." And so I think that's what 10 episodes a season forces you to do, is really make sure that every story counts as much as it possibly can. And I like that. I like what that affords us now. And I think there's a lot to unpack there about old Trek and about new Trek, whether that's true about not having filler episodes, whether that's a good thing, whether we wish they would do more of it. And I mean, how we feel about those old Trek where they were just, quote, spinning their wheels.
So I don't think there's that many of them. And I feel like there's a lot of stuff missing because they don't have that time to breathe, but they're still filler episodes.
Yep.
Here's the thing. I kind of feel. Yeah.
Sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Welcome to the show, Keith.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I just had a complete network failure, but I
no.
am up and running finally.
I kind of feel like the whole like modern television model of like sequential episodes, everything is in series and everything ties in together, has totally changed our way of that we think about television. Back at that time there were episodes that I liked, episodes I didn't like, but I never thought of any of them as filler. They were just the new episode this week. I never thought of it in that term. So I don't really, and I don't go back and look at Next Gen or Voyager or whatever and think, that was just, total filler.
Right.
Unnecessary, because something important happens in every episode. It might be an episode you don't like. It might not be,
it might not drive the overall arcing story that they might have in that particular season.
Right. And most of them didn't have that.
Right.
So it might not be an episode of like huge consequence or anything, but it'll have a good character moment for Data or Troy or whoever. And that's just as important. And I think the average every week story is just as great as the monumental tentpoles of the series.
Right. Like, I think most people would agree, even with Next Gen not being serialized, episodes like Best of Both Worlds or the Klingon episode you'd get each year or the Barclay episode or whatever that would sort of continue the ongoing arcs, or like if it was a story about Data and the Sungs or whatever the case may be, it's hard to find. I tried to look for lists of episodes people consider filler episodes because it seems kind of difficult to define. But you can find the opposite, where you find here's the must-watch, no filler list for the Next Generation, and like the first 2 seasons, there's like 4 episodes you're supposed to watch.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, these are writers who are writing an episode of television. No one is going in with the intention of, this isn't going to be a classic, so I'm just going to, paint by the numbers and get it done. I mean, no one does that.
No.
Right. And I think there certainly were times when, because it was a factory, they were cranking out 22 episodes a season. There certainly were times when they're like, we have to have a script on Thursday, right. And so they were just putting one word after the other and trying to get a story. But I think they were always trying to do good stories. Sometimes they were in that situation because Michael Piller threw a script in the trash can and said, all right, we need something different. This ain't working,
Sure, of course.
But then you have like the bottle episodes that I think some people might consider filler episodes, where nothing consequential happens. It's just the adventure of the week on the Enterprise or the Defiant or whatever the case may be. Yeah. And, and I think TNG does have quite a lot of those, but I don't know that, I don't think that's a bad thing.
No, I don't either. It gets you to know the crew. It gets you to know the ship in ways that you might not have time to do otherwise.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a lot that gets missed out on only doing 10 episodes a week or a season.
Oh yeah. Yeah. What do you think, Keith?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that the definition of filler can kind of vary. For example, I really wouldn't say the original series had any filler episodes. Not that I call filler, because one, it was episodic, and it was basically a new adventure every week. So whether you don't like some episodes, like "And the Children Shall Eat," which is probably my least favorite,
Right.
it's arguably my least favorite Star Trek episode of all time, or the Corbomite Maneuver, which was, that was a kind of a standalone. Their adventures of the week. So I think that's okay. Now, where I do think sometimes the concept of filler can come in is two things. One, if you have an ongoing storyline and they seem to veer from it out of nowhere, sometimes you might hear that with, say, this was Enterprise, Charles's show, was accused of that during the Xindi War. There's an episode that often gets brought up as a filler, which I actually like. I don't know if Alan likes it, because it's a Western. It's called North Star. And they just end up on a planet where some aliens, you never know that Star Trek does weird episodes where for some reason aliens travel what must have been hundreds of thousands of light years, grab some humans and drag them to another planet. It makes no sense at all. And it's basically a Western. And it has nothing to do with the Xindi arc or anything, but I just like it. But it's filler in the middle of the Xindi arc. And that's a hard thing, because how do you define an episode that doesn't have to do with the greater war versus something that everybody like Shakespeare did, which is give you a moment to let your hair down and breathe in the middle of a drama. That's a tough one.
I mean, you could say that "Take Me Out to the Holosuite" is a filler episode.
Good point.
But it's not.
Right.
But it's an amazing episode.
Yeah, but I remember people complaining about that for 20 years. I mean, because it was sort of right smack in the middle of the Dominion War, like it was heating up.
Yeah.
Like, let's take a week off to all play baseball in the Holosuite.
Right.
But you need to.
To Keith's point, I do think that in the first half of the Xindi season, there are a number of episodes that you kind of like, they're saving the big development of the story plot for the second half of the season. And there's mentions of Xindi, and they're, screwing around with, gravity bubbles or whatever that nonsense was. And you kind of do feel like on rewatch that maybe you're like, oh, let's get on with the Xindi stuff. Let's, get into the Expanse. Let's find the Xindi. But at that time, it was building suspense. It was delaying, it was plotting out the story that it's going to be telling for an entire season. And it was kind of a new-ish concept. And, I don't, at the time, it never occurred to me that it was filler.
Right. So
let me go back and get a whole slew of comments that we need to wrap up before we get too far in. Our friend, the Vulcan Science Directorate, says, "Hi again. Looking forward to hearing all your thoughts." That's a dangerous thing to say, because I have lots of thoughts on lots of things. Matt Sweatman says, "Hello, everyone. It's EST time."
Hey.
Mark says, "Hailing frequencies open." And let's see.
Tally ho, Mark.
There were no filler episodes in episodic TV. Each was a standalone. Exactly. Some better than others, but none of them were intended to be filler or ended up being filler. Elaine says, "Looking back, you can probably find filler episodes, but back in the day, all shows had 20 plus episodes a season. So we were just used to those kind of episodes." Exactly.
Like, for example, like, take Friends. Like, how many episodes do they have? Did any of them have any continuing arc? Pretty much no. Not at all. Right. So they were all filler episodes? What?
There were arcs on Friends, but they're more relationship arcs.
There were, the character arcs and not plot arcs. But then Elaine says, on the other hand, I do like the shorter seasons, but I think some shows could stand to have maybe 12 episodes instead of 8 to 10.
15.
Yeah. 15 is a good number. Yeah. The Vulcan Science Directorate says some of the filler episodes that go away from the main story are some of the best episodes, like The Visitor. And Mark wraps up our first volley of comments by saying the Vic Fontaine episodes at the height of the Dominion War actually made me kind of angry.
Do tell, Mark. Are you back to the thing where you think they were? Do you think they're truly filler, or you just think they didn't fit in? Because it's funny. Given the war, and if you've seen all those war movies where somebody ends up at a club in Vichy, France, or something like that. I like those episodes because, again, I think like Shakespeare did it. Sometimes people need to relax, and even in the middle of a war. I I watch a lot of old movies, and you'd be surprised how many comedies there are. I mean, a million comedies where the stars are on basically they're on leave from the middle of World War II, and they have all kinds of hijinks. And it's always weird because, like, next week you're going to be back on the lines getting shot at. But
Right.
there they are.
Mhm. So as far as filler episodes go, I have come up with, there might be more, but I've come up with one true textbook example of a filler episode.
Okay.
But it ends up being one of the greatest episodes of Star Trek in the entire franchise. And Chuck, you mentioned it a few minutes ago, and that is Chains of Command Part 2. Because as we all know, that was intended to be a one episode story.
Mm.
And I think it was Pillar who said, let's do an extra long story for one of these to stretch the budget, use existing sets, use a small number of sets, no big cast, guest cast or anything like that. And that was the one that went into a second episode. So it wasn't originally intended to have a second episode,
Right.
but that first episode, no one ever talks about that one. It's the second episode that was written in order to fill an order from the boss who said, we need to make a two-parter.
Yeah.
And that second episode is gripping. It is dramatic. It has a Tour de France performance by Patrick Stewart.
Right.
And it is literally one of the greatest episodes in the history of Trek.
Mhm.
And it would never have happened in the original plan for that season.
Right.
Okay, two things there. Did you guys mention the term pillar filler since you mentioned?
No,
No, but go ahead.
Yeah. There's a term. There's a term that a lot of the actors and production people behind the scenes used to throw around in Star Trek, and it was called pillar filler by Michael Piller, where they sometimes felt that Piller was doing what Alan was just saying, just throwing a filler episode in. So that was a famous term. And Alan, I'm stunned. I didn't know what you just said. I did not know Chain of Command was a one episode initial draft. I am stunned. Wow. I'm stunned. I mean, I'm really blowing my mind. I had what? So what were they going to end it with then? How are they going to do that?
I don't know what the original script looked like, the original draft that they submitted. But I'm sure that they were just going to rescue Picard from the Cardassians and get him back on the ship and fly off to the next episode instead of having him captured and tortured for an entire episode.
Right.
That's amazing.
And that's one of the all-time great TNG moments.
Yes.
Yeah, one that I thought of that was, I think, a textbook case of filler and is not as highly lauded as Chain of Command Part 2 was season 2's finale, Shades of Grey.
True.
They needed an episode, and there was a writer's strike, and that was Veronica. That was the clip show, where basically Riker is stung by a thorn and is passed out, and relives the gems of the first two seasons along the way.
I would say clip episodes are definitely filler episodes, regardless of which series they come from.
But I think a lot of times too, the term filler is used for just sort of unremarkable episodes, and you get the same sort of thing. People talking about albums where you have, is it killer, is it filler? Where you have just the songs that they're not special. And it's not like the episodes that are not like a special episode or a great performance. It's just Star Trek this week. And we've talked about that before, where sometimes it's just an episode of Star Trek this week. And that was fine. And now I will go on with my life,
fine. Right. And it was part of the flow of the season,
Because every episode doesn't have to be Chain of Command Part 2. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to have that every single week.
And not every episode can be that.
Right.
And it's so funny that you bring up albums, because that's exactly what I was thinking of earlier today. And there are so many examples of an album being delivered to the record label or the producer or whatever, and them saying, this is fine, but there's no big single. Do one more. And the one more is technically a filler song to fill out an album, but it ends up being a massive hit. Like Prince's song Kiss was a last minute thing, and he threw it on the album. And there's so many examples of that, of a last minute, the last thing that was written for an album to get the album completed ends up being released as a single and ends up being a massive hit.
There's a lot of stories like that in Star Trek as well, where they're like, we were just scrambling and we had to get it done this weekend. And so we all took one act of the script and it's like, yesterday's Enterprise. You know what I mean? It'll be like an all-time classic, because sometimes that scramble and that like that creative jolt that you get from it, sometimes you get some good results from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of comments, and Matt Sweatman says filler episodes give us such good memories, like the one with the sign language negotiator, the true story about Morn,
Mhm.
or learn that Beverly really likes ghosts.
You know
There's
what's
nothing
funny?
filler about that episode.
What's funny is of all those, the only one I think of as possibly filler is Sub Rosa. The other two I wouldn't consider fillers. And that's funny. I think the definition is so incredibly fluid.
Right.
That we said about what fillers are. Is the one that what does he say? The sign language negotiation. Oh, that's what was his name? Is it Reva?
Yeah.
Reva. Yeah. So I
Yeah,
wouldn't call that. I wouldn't call that filler. Yeah, I was a whisper. Thank you. I wouldn't call that filler. I would just call that an episode of the week for Star Trek. But I like that one. I would call Sub Rosa. You know, there's one thing I was gonna. Well, one thing I want to say real quick, Charles. I'm crossing the stream, so I watched another clip episode of Stargate SG-1, and I said this a few weeks ago, and Charles like, seriously, dude, in my entire life, I've never watched a clip episode of anything that I like. And so, Shades of Grey, I would definitely say is a filler. And yeah, that was a bad episode. Another thing I was thinking about
the SG-1 clip episodes, there was chances for that to be really great.
Yeah, there were some good SG-1 clip episodes.
They were all bad,
No.
but that's just me.
You're wrong.
Another thing I think about filler when you say it's filler, I think it goes back to what your subjective definition is. There are many episodes in season 7 of TNG I would call filler only, and also there's a couple in Voyager, only because people they hadn't paid a lot of attention to in certain ways suddenly got episodes. And it just kind of seemed like Geordi's mom in, I think it's, Interface. The whole episode with Geordi's mom, you didn't even really know he had a mother and a father that were in the Starfleet and stuff like that. And it was, now it's not like they hadn't dealt with Geordi before. He'd had episodes, but it just seemed weird that they were worried about Geordi's personal life or family life on that level in the 7th season. So even when I watch it now, it's like, oh, it's like they're running out of ideas, so they're just going to slap this episode here.
All right.
It's not a great episode.
Hey, have we ever shown Geordi's parents?
Yeah.
Oh, well, we're almost out of time.
Yeah, that feels like a filler.
Right.
That feels like a strange one. It's like I think Alan made a good point about Enterprise. I've heard those comments again too. Yeah, about the Xindi War, where some people like that arc was a little. It had a lot of filler, and I think that also goes back to, as I think you guys know, the Xindi War they felt they had to do because of 9/11, but they were also still having to do that mess with the temporal Cold War. And so because the network forced them to do the temporal Cold War, Berman and Braga wanted nothing to do with the temporal Cold War. The network forced that mess on them. They did feel they were getting too stretched. And so, yeah, so they wanted to do the Xindi arc. Then, of course, they wanted Enterprise to stay on Earth for a year before it went to space. They didn't want to go to Klingon homeworld as fast. They didn't want to do the temporal Cold War. They wanted to do the Xindi arc, but the network was always messing with them. So to your point, Alan, yeah, sometimes they did throw out stuff. They're like, well, we just got to find some time to fill all this crap because now we got to go back to that stupid temporal Cold War when we're done. And that's network interference.
Yeah, I think with TNG, I mean, like we said, it's not a serialized show. So I think really any episode that wouldn't end up on a must-watch TNG list is not essential viewing, I think would have the potential to be called filler. And I was thinking of an episode like Clues that is not a consequential episode. You could skip it and not miss a single thing. But it's just a delightful, it's just an episode where they all get amnesia, and there's an extra guy when they wake up, and there's a little mystery for them to solve, and then they carry on. You know, I think that's a good example of an episode like that. But I think episodes like that are really delightful. It doesn't have to be like end of the galaxy stakes every single. I mean, for the episode to matter. Right. There's no huge part of anyone's story arc. There's no big revelation that changes the show. There's no, catastrophic, galaxy ending catastrophe if they don't solve this little mystery. It's just the sort of a little mystery of the week on the Enterprise. And the mystery is, who are we? And who's this guy? But that's kind of the fun of it, though. I mean, I think it's the low stakes episodes, I think, are just part of Star Trek.
Right. And everything can't be high stakes every single week because any crew would burn out if that was the case.
Sure, yeah.
I'm talking like in real world examples, So a couple of comments. Elaine says, reminds us that every sitcom in the 80s had a clip show. And that is correct. And my favorite show, The Golden Girls, in their later half did one or two every season.
Okay.
And our friends over at the Vulcan Science Directorate says The Visitor where Jake grows old and his father disappears, is one of the best. What do you think? And
Yes.
I just want to say really quickly, people who are watching, throw out examples of
Please.
filler episodes that you think of and let us, talk about those. I would love to hear what some of the things are that you're coming from.
Yeah, and good or bad. I mean, it could be,
Right.
I hate this episode because it was filler, or I love this episode because it was filler, or, that sort of thing. Yeah, and the Visitor, I don't think you're going to get any argument from us.
No.
It's one of the all-time great Star Trek episodes. Absolutely. But, I mean, again, and it's not one that is necessarily, because by the end, the whole thing only happened in Sisko's memory, and he didn't witness most of the events of the episode, right? So, I mean, it's all following an alternate timeline Jake Sisko throughout his life. But I think it's a really great character piece for Jake and for Ben, even though Ben's not in a lot of it.
Yeah.
And just showing, I mean, just Jake had already lost his mother, and what would his life be without his father? And just that obsession. And I think it's a wonderful episode. It's just a great piece of science fiction television.
Yeah, exactly. It was one of those concepts that not a lot of shows would dare to do. And Star Trek. And when you think of Star Trek, you think of space exploration, and you think of pew pew and starships flying across the galaxy and stuff like that. You don't think of, at least immediately, you don't think of these quiet character building episodes that explores a concept. And those are some of my favorite episodes.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Matt says, like Clues, cause and effect has little to do with an ongoing continuity, but what a great episode. That is one of my absolute favorites.
Yeah, and that's one that, I mean, it's like the episode, like the story is like 5 minutes long, but it happens over and over and over again throughout the, like every act break, the Enterprise blows up.
And it's almost like a clip show where you think it could have been a filler episode, but it's not, because every time that story repeats in every segment of the show, you learn a little bit more. It's shot differently. They're not just repeating shots from the previous one. They're, Frakes directed it, and I think it was his first one that he ever directed. And he does so many inventive things with it. And I think it's just a visual feast, as they say.
Yeah, I think his first one he ever directed was The Offspring, where Data had a baby.
Yeah, I forget about that all the time.
Wow.
Yeah, not a bad way to start, right?
And both of those episodes y'all mentioned about Frakes are in my top 10 to TNG.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just good. I mean, because you get to know the characters, just watching the characters solve a mystery. And then, I mean, Clues and Cause and Effect both have that element where it's the characters solving the mystery. And I mean, it has a very dramatic opening for Cause and Effect, but I don't think anyone, even on their first viewing, thought, oh no, the Enterprise was destroyed and everyone died in the first 5 minutes. Like, we all know that the adventures of the Enterprise, but it's like what happened and how are they going to get out of this one?
The surprise for me wasn't the opening where the Enterprise blows up, because you think, okay, they frequently do this thing where they start an episode at the end of a story, but then by the end of the episode, they've worked around it. The big shock to me was that after that, you go through the opening credits and the first commercials, and that first segment ends that same damn way. And I was like, what is going on? That blew me away. Okay. Mark says the fairy tale episode so early in the run of Strange New Worlds came as a little bit of a shock to me.
Mark, just so you know, that's the only episode of Strange New Worlds so far I actively dislike. So I hear you, but I wouldn't call it filler.
Matt says Assignment Earth as a backdoor pilot is kind of a filler episode of the original series.
True.
Yeah.
And funny about that, bringing up Assignment Earth. While a lot of people like it, I'm surprised how the number of people who actively dislike that episode. It's way more than I thought. Yeah, and I think because what Alan just said that he just said, which is they get mad because they say Kirk and Spock are reduced to guests in their own show. I have no problem with that episode, even if it's a backdoor pilot. I think it's a great episode. Of course, it helps help me with the name. I should know the name of the actor who played Gary Seven.
Robert. It'll come to me.
Yeah, no, Lansing. Yeah. Oh, I just saw him in a Western 2 nights ago. It's a good episode. Yes, it's a Doctor Who kind of, sort of, but I think it's a good episode. And even I had to let the plot stuff go, because for the first time, they're like, oh yeah, Assignment Earth, we time travel now. That's what we do. After that, they don't do that anymore. But
that's
like
good
it.
continuity for the 60s, though, because they didn't often
Yeah.
pick up on something from previous episodes. That was the third episode with that slingshot maneuver time travel, after the Naked Time and Tomorrow's Yesterday, where and now to the point where we decided to go back in time. So we did.
Yeah. And it's funny you guys said it. It's such a great episode. I like, even though I know she, rest her soul, Terry Garr, hated that experience there for some reason. I love Lansing because he's just cool. He's just cool. When he first shows up on the ship, there's so much about that episode I like. And, they use the same music that they use a billion times in Star Trek, when the satellite is cutting down. That's still one of the most exciting times I've ever seen in Star Trek. I love that episode.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, a couple of comments. Mark says, "Take Me Out to the Holosuite" is top 5 DS9.
Amen, Mark.
And going back to his mention of the fairy tale episode, he says, however, the musical episode of Strange New Worlds is top tier. Love it.
Wow.
However, the musical episode cannot in any form or fashion be considered filler because it moves the overarching plot along for multiple characters.
Yeah, well, it moves the character arcs along.
Yes.
Right. It's not like the plot of the universe or the storyline. It's the character arcs that get moved along the plot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd say the fairy tale episode
Okay, they are frozen. So go on to our next comment, which is from the Vulcan Science Directorate, who says, "I love both of those, the ones that Mark just mentioned. I watch Subspace Rhapsody often and listen to the soundtrack in my car." So that brings up a topic that we had mentioned before we went live, and that is, with Alex Kurtzman talking about the old shows and filler episodes, and that not being a thing in modern Trek. Is that true? Are there filler episodes in modern Trek?
I know of one, unless I'm still frozen. Am I?
No,
you're
frozen. You're
Oh, good.
You're good. You're back.
The first one that comes to my mind is in Picard season 2, when you're deep into this plot and you only have 10 episodes, and then they get captured by this FBI guy, and we spend an episode learning about how he saw a Vulcan when he was a kid, and then by the end they escape from him, and it's like, what? This is a waste of an hour of this,
and they didn't use him ever again.
It had nothing to do with anything.
Yep. Right.
I think Kurtzman is, well, I'll say it this way. I think Kurtzman's correct in that they don't do it anymore. I think he's incorrect if he's implying they can't do it anymore. Of course, you can still write 20, 25 episodes a season. And as you guys just pointed out, and Charles, I just forgot about that, you can have a 10-episode season and still have stinkers in that 10th episode. So it's not like you magically, and what's most often cited is not even stuff on streaming. What's most often cited is British television, because a ton of British shows for years have been 10, 12, 13 episodes. But that doesn't mean that they're still all excellent. So I agree. I disagree with Kurtzman saying you can't do 26 episodes anymore. Will it burn you out? Hell yeah. But can you do a good 26 episode season? Well, they did it for years, so of course you can.
Yep.
Well, most network shows still do it. I mean, when you're talking about any hospital show or detective show on network, they still do that.
Yeah.
It's not an impossibility, but the way that that streaming television, and certainly streaming science fiction television, is produced in the modern era, it would be astronomically expensive to do 20 episodes a year.
Yeah,
because they spend too much money on stupid things.
Well, and
I agree with that.
And they spend a lot of time. I mean,
They do spend a lot of time.
2 or more weeks filming an episode, whereas it used to be they'd have like 6 days, and they're on to the next one.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, here's one. Matt says, "I think Devil's Due as a recycled Phase 2 script is a filler."
Sure.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I can see the argument for that.
And there was a number of those Phase 2 episodes that got reused, some out of necessity.
The Child was one.
The
during
Child
the
was
strike.
Right, exactly. Mark says, "I could argue taking 3 episodes to get Picard out into space in Picard is filler."
Yeah. And that
it did drag on a little bit.
And that's one of those things. I was just thinking about that in regards to Discovery in the 4th season, when you have that sort of stretch in the back half. That I don't know if there's necessarily an episode that was filler in the same way, but they were certainly padded. And I think the beginning of Picard had that same problem where it did feel Like, come on, let's go to space. Let's get something going. Like, this is taking forever. And so you do get that in the modern era. And I think it's even more pronounced in the modern era when they're going episode to episode to episode on a single topic. And if you're not into it, for one, it drags. But also, I mean, when it's padded and you feel like, oh man, I really feel like they're padding this out because they have 6 more episodes left.
More.
Yeah. I do think it's more noticeable because it's not an episode that's off and then you're back the next week to something else. You're on that for you have because more attention paid to it for me.
And certainly in Discovery seasons 2 and 3, which were 13 or 15 episodes or whatever, I do think there was some time where it was like, get on with stuff. And it's not to say that I didn't like those seasons, because I loved seasons 2 and 4. But there were times when I'm like, okay, so they're still doing things to fill out their number of runs that they have to do. And they can't say, I mean, he can say, but he's not right, that there isn't filler in the modern shows. And it has nothing to do with liking or not liking an episode, because any episode that somebody doesn't like, they're going to think of as a filler. But it's whether it serves a purpose, it's whether it, like the one that Chuck was talking about, the Picard one, where it begins and ends and has no consequence on anything else that happens. It certainly can be filler. Agreed. So Matt says Picard season 2 is a filler season. Get out of town, buddy.
He beat me to saying that. I was going to say the same thing.
What? No, I know we all kind of dog on that one, and I really loved the first half, and then it just went kind of bonkers in the second half, and it just made no sense.
Right.
So our buddy Wayne has made it. Good to see you, Wayne.
What's up, Wayne?
And our friends at the Vulcan Science Directorate said yesterday's Enterprise was great. There's a cool story about the way that episode was put together.
Okay. That's one of my favorites too.
Oh yeah, I mean that's an absolute banger of an episode.
Right, and I wouldn't call that a filler either. I think it's just another great episode of the week.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely love that one.
All right, so we're about halfway, so we're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back after a couple of commercials. So we'll see you on the other side, if I can decide which ones to show. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Gina Shock from the Go-Go's, fabulous drummer of the Go-Go's.
Hi, this is Tony Levin of King Crimson.
Hi, this is David Fishoff of the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp.
Hi, this is Richard Evans. I am the author of Listening to the Music the Machines Make.
Hi, this is Teresa Kariakis, punk rock photographer.
Hi, I'm Tom Beaujour, author of Nothing But a Good Time, and you are listening to Modern Musicology.
Modern Musicology.
Modern Musicology.
You're listening to Modern Musicology, so, pay attention. You might learn something.
Attention, people of Earth.
Turned on the TV late last night.
'Cause I felt nerdy.
Saved the galaxy from a fright.
'Cause I felt nerdy.
Turned on the TV late last night. 'Cause I felt nerdy. Then my gravity and took flight. 'Cause I felt nerdy.
Exterminate, okay, destroy. I have to go. Having some problems up here. Good luck. Stay safe. See you soon.
I love those.
Oh, I do too. All right. So people who are watching, why don't you throw out a few more episodes for us to talk about, whether you consider them filler or just to see if we consider them filler. Hang on one second. Let me switch back over to my.
Looks like we lost Charles.
Wayne says, I so missed the Felt Nerdy commercial.
You got it.
There it is again. You might see it again next week. Who knows? All right. Mark says, I have been catching up with Star Trek Prodigy now that it is on Netflix. I cannot think of one filler episode in a 20 episode overarching plot. The shorter episodes really move things along. I totally agree with that.
Good comment.
Yeah, absolutely. And Prodigy is such a strong show in ways that I wasn't really sure that it was going to be when it started. Mm-hmm. And I really do think that every single episode of that show has been so good and has really added to I mean, that is a tightly plotted show.
Right.
And yeah, I agree with you on that one. Matt says Carbon Creek might be the best episode of Enterprise, and it is completely filler.
You know what's funny? It is one of my least favorite episodes of Enterprise. I don't like Carbon Creek.
Oh, Keith.
I know. I don't dislike it. It doesn't do anything for me. And it's weird. This is why taste is so incredibly subjective. It is not because it's in the past. It's not because T'Pol's grandmother looked just like her, anything like that. It just doesn't do anything for me. And I don't go into a science fiction show like Enterprise expecting, pew pew or alien invasion, nothing like that. It just doesn't do much for me. But now, would you call that filler? Because it is definitely, arguably, the most popular episode of the entire series. He said.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I don't think of it as filler. But I mean, I guess I can see why you would say that. Because it basically does take a pause from whatever's going on and give T'Pol an opportunity to tell a story.
Right.
So it doesn't affect anything except for the length of the meal at which she and Trip and the captain are sitting, while she tells this story. And I think that's the same one where she uses a knife to saw a breadstick in half or something. I don't know. But no, I love that episode. Now, loving it and not loving it does not necessarily define it as a filler, of course.
Right.
The Vulcan Science Directorate says that they love Carbon Creek.
Most people do.
Yep. And Wayne says filler episodes, suddenly K-pop comes to mind. No, it's a good thing Veronica is not here.
Yeah. Actually, Wayne, I forget, did you like that episode or not? I don't know if let us know. I forget if you actually liked it or disliked it. I think it's fine. I don't hate it. Hey, they're back.
Oh,
hey.
Uh-oh. Veronica made it just in time to see this last comment.
Yeah. Wayne was saying that the K-pop, he said the Strange New Worlds K-pop episode comes to mind as filler. Now, he did not say it was bad. So I was waiting to find out if Wayne liked it or not. Because, we keep saying just because you think it's filler doesn't mean you actually dislike it. One of the folks earlier said something, again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. They were talking about, I keep forgetting, Take Me Out to the Holosuite, the famous baseball game in DS9 is a filler. And again, in doing research, I was reading about it actually last week. A lot of people complain it's a filler episode. And I looked it up and had forgotten. It's like season 7, episode 4. So it's solidly in the Dominion War. But again, Shakespeare and others, and in real life, you cannot live in that level of intensity and fear and hatred and horror, even in the middle of the worst war. We have real life wars going on now. And I know sometimes people are like, well, how can this leader be somewhere having dinner and relaxing when his people or her people are dying? Because that's what humans do. And I think it's a great episode, Take Me Out to the Holosuite, because you do need a break from that.
And I thought it was interesting that for Mark, that he was annoyed by Bada Bing Bada Bang because all of a sudden you're in the Holosuite episode. But then Take Me Out to the Holosuite is one that he likes. And they're both sort of had that same sort of criticism level against them, that they were in the middle of the Dominion War and you're taking these sort of side quests for a fun little lark.
Paper Moon?
Well, Paper Moon, I mean, I guess I could see that, but it was such a heavy...
It's definitely not a filler episode, but it's a Vic episode. Sort of. Vic Nog episode.
The one that really comes to mind for me is In the Cards, which is right before the end of season 6.
Yes.
Or season 5, I don't remember. But it's like right before your big finale, and you're just like the whole war is about to hit the fan. And they stop the show for this episode where Jake and Nog go on this little quest to get a present for his father or whatever. And it's an amazing episode. It's such a sweet episode, but you can kind of see how somebody would think of it as filler. Like, we have to delay our finale for 1 week because it doesn't happen until next week. What are we going to do this week? But I still love it. Now, Elaine has a great question, and that is, would you say there are any filler episodes in Lower Decks?
No.
I wouldn't say that in a derogatory way. I think there are certainly episodes that were just fine, and I moved on and carried on with my life. You know what I mean? They weren't all the bangers. If we're going back to the sort of killer or filler definition of it, Lower Decks wasn't super arc heavy, even the character arcs. They progressed as the show progressed. But I think there are certainly episodes where it was just like, oh yeah, there was a little bit of weird hijinks this week.
Yeah.
Vulcan Science Directory throws out, hang on, dang it, throws out Far Beyond the Stars.
Keith, were you making that noise because you don't like Far Beyond the Stars?
Yeah, right. No, I love that episode. That's why Veronica's laughing, and I'm going, ooh.
I know.
Yeah, that's a great episode.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, a viewer could skip it and not miss a thing, aside from a great episode of TV. But I mean, as far as just following along with the plot and with the because I mean, most of our characters aren't in it, except for in very small appearances. Everybody's playing somebody else.
Right. Yeah. And Alan mentioned in the cards, and again, that's another one that gets criticized by some fans. I sometimes think some people don't read Shakespeare or didn't read Shakespeare because, Alan, you say that the showrunners were criticized in the cards. And again, they said, we're getting ready to get into some heavy stuff. We wanted the people to take a pause and catch their breath. And if you even look at the episode, the reason Jake wanted to do it is because he knew his dad was dealing with pressures beyond anything.
Right.
I mean, that's the episode that has the freaking soulless minions of orthodoxy, which I just love. And yeah, it's silly because you knew what was coming in the next episode. And that's why they did it. Calm before the storm.
But I think too, like these episodes where you just get to live with the characters for a week. Later on the show, when they're in higher stake situations, I feel like you have a greater bond with them because you spent some time with them. That's one of the criticisms I have of Discovery, and that's a show that I like, but you don't get to spend a lot of time with the characters just being people. I mean, it was such a strange left turn on Discovery when they had that episode where Ariam died, but they had a little montage at the beginning where you get to hang out in the mess hall and you get to see the characters on the show, not just spouting plot, but just living on the ship. And I mean, I think that was one of the most intense character oriented segments of the show, because you actually got to, they weren't saying anything that was hugely consequential or solving the mysteries of the universe. They were just going to lunch and talking to their friends. And you'd get little scenes like that sort of peppered along Deep Space Nine. They did a great job of it because you'd have like 5 minutes in the runabout where Julian and Miles were just talking about Keiko, or where Dax and Worf were just talking about their relationship. And it wasn't some huge plot thing, but it was just letting the characters just be people for a minute. But I think even having whole episodes like that, where the characters are just existing on the ship and in the universe, and it just endears you to them more, and you understand these characters better when they are fighting the Dominion or whatever the case may be.
Right. And that brings up a couple of things that to me are interesting episodes, but you kind of feel like, they're not the ones that people bring up a lot. They're not ones that are like super consequential. And that's things like Data's Day or Pen Pals, which, they're smaller, quieter episodes, but they're good episodes. And just because there's not, a battle with a Romulan ship doesn't mean it's not important.
And kind of going back to what you were saying, Alan, about taking a breather moment with some of the intense stuff, like Strange New World Season 2. There was those old scientists, and then there was the Klingon murder death episode, and then there was Subspace Rhapsody. So, they balanced it on both sides.
Right.
Yeah, that show can give you whiplash. What if you find out your chief medical officer is a brutal assassin, then the next week you got Klingon K-pop? But yeah.
And the weird thing about Data's Day was that the A plot was the android getting ready for a wedding, and the B plot was like a Romulus assassination thing going on.
Right. That's so funny. Flipping those expectations.
Right.
Matt Sweatman says, sometimes Transfigurations feels like a filler episode because when watching it in order, we know what's coming next.
That's a good episode too. I like that episode.
Yeah, it's a weird episode. not that weird is bad. There are like a lot of weird episodes.
Yeah.
But the Vulcan Science Directorate says Vanishing Point in Enterprise makes me mad.
Why is that?
I do not remember which one that is.
Enterprise makes me mad too. You had to get that in there.
Yeah. Charles, you said something I think is very interesting. You mentioned those moments where you get to know the people, and that goes back to not necessarily filler episodes, but filler, what some people would call filler moments, like you were saying.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I lament from the original series is, as the show went on, those little moments where the crew just did stuff that had nothing to do with the greater plot, they disappeared more as the show went on. It was early in the series where you'd have Uhura singing Charlie's Our New Dolly just for kicks. or Kirk and Spock playing chess, and it didn't necessarily have anything to do with the episode. It was those little moments, those little personal moments that, like you said, that makes you know the people more than just these heroes, these larger than life heroes. And it's one reason they brought the poker game to TNG, because they wanted to remind you these are humans, and between these incredible missions, they just chill. And then, of course, Beverly and Deanna used to do those weird stretches that became the source of many memes. But you know, when they used to do their little workout, you wanted to show them doing other stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like if you know a fireman and you only know him while he's fighting fires, as opposed to just like hanging out at the firehouse for a week and getting to know them as a person and then fighting a fire. And then you care so much more about that individual than you might otherwise. And I think that that's something that gets lost in these modern shows where they're all prestige dramas and they're all serialized. Well, not all, but often. And there's such shorter seasons is you don't have those episodes where you're just hanging out in the ship.
So I have a great example from the 60s of that.
Okay.
The Monkees.
Okay.
They did not introduce them and get to know the characters in the original pilot. And then they put that little thing right in the beginning. It's like, hey, get to know the guys. And suddenly they knew these people and they were invested in them. And
what
they
you're talking
enjoyed
about
it.
is the original test screening for the pilot tanked. And then they added the screen test on the beginning so that the audience would know more about who these people are in the show. And then all of a sudden the reviews of it shot up.
Go figure.
Right. But and I think that for Star Trek, it works that way as well. And I mean, I keep saying this over and over again, but it doesn't have to be high stakes every week.
Right. Crossing the streams like I've never crossed the streams before, but Charles, you were talking about getting to know people behind the scenes, and they're just not always heroes.
Right.
One of the greatest I've read one of the greatest jokesters in real life history, joked all the time, played jokes on people, clowned all the time, was Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh wow.
And yeah, right. You know, most people ain't think of him as making big speeches and talking like this. Well, when he wasn't doing that, I mean, it's not like he was in the kitchen eating dinner. It's like, baby, bring me some more fried chicken. I mean, you know, and he was evidently an incredible jokester. Although almost every day he went out, he had to think about somebody killing him.
Sure.
And so it's a completely different thing. And then as life goes on with his daughters and stuff, you're seeing more, because most of the time you see pictures of him, marching Washington, blah, blah, blah. And then you see these pictures, the pictures that mean the most to his family, it's him lying on the floor playing with his kids.
Right.
And I remember when I first saw that, I was like, oh, I didn't know he was a regular guy.
Right. Right. You said, imagine him like coming out of the bathroom in the morning, like in a towel, like.
Right.
Yeah. And now, one episode that I think that I would consider filler from Strange New Worlds, and this is really just because I always forget that it even exists, is that one where they were in the nebula and Uhura figured something out and they blew up the thing that was getting the particles. Do you remember that one in season 2? That was just this past season on Strange New Worlds. And they had this whole plot in the nebula where they like the collector of the things, and Uhura made contact with the aliens in the cloud or whatever. And every time, like, because I'm always thinking of like the big swings that they do, you know, the Vulcan hijinks episode or the big drama. And I was like, every time I'm going through it, I was like, oh, I forgot this episode even happened. You know,
was that the same one where Pike actually became fleet captain
for a day? That's the part of it that we remember, is that Pike was fleet captain for a day so he could meet Kirk.
Oh yeah, that one.
Because he was captain of his ship and that collector thing until it blew up.
That's right. No, I agree with you. That would be a filler episode.
Yeah.
I think I need to rewatch that, like that season before season 3 starts.
It was a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. We were talking about Enterprise again, which I know Charles just loves so much, but Alan would remember this during the Xindi arc. There was the episode. Remember it's called Chosen Realm, and it was the episode which sounds ludicrous, but it's real life. It was the episode when the religious fanatics got on board Enterprise. It kind of feels like Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, and spoilers, but it was so weird. It sounds stupid, but it's actually true in real life. The religious fanatics get on the ship, take over the ship. One of them commits suicide just to show them how serious they are, because they want to use the Enterprise to basically punish their enemies. This sounds so much like Let That Be Your Last Battlefield and other stuff. And it turns out that the point of this battle, that just like Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, at the end of the show, you find out destroyed their entire planet and all life on it, was that one group said it took whatever their gods 5 days to create the universe, and another group said 4 days. And it was literally that silly.
Right.
But that was in the middle of the Xindi story war arc. And so that was absolutely filler. Now that was a classic Star Trek theme. As a matter of fact, it's a recycled plot. It was right in the middle of the Xindi story arc because I guess they needed to fill out that episode, that season.
Yeah. So I guess what we're deciding is they need to do more filler episodes.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, filler moments.
Here's a point from Matt. Those character moments are what endears these characters to us. Riker playing trombone, Picard loving archaeology, Cisco loving baseball, his family's restaurant are important details.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I agree.
Yeah. And like I said, that was something I think Discovery struggled with, because by the end of the show, you really don't feel like you have a good, like even Reese was on it all the way through. And occasionally he'd throw out something like, my family survived a hurricane one time. And, but you don't really feel like you got to know the guy,
no,
you know, in 5 seasons on the show.
Right. 100%. And, you know, it's funny because, you know, my favorite character, Owo, got her a couple of little moments, like something about being able to hold her breath for 10 minutes. And, you know, there was that thing in season 2 where you find out that her family belonged to a Luddite colony. And that is a fascinating concept that in whatever century that was in, 22nd or whatever it is century, that there are still Luddites, and that you have a character that comes from that background who goes into Starfleet. How does that change the relationship with your family? Do they disown you? That's fascinating stuff that they did nothing with.
Yeah, I'd have been interested to find out just what a Luddite is considered in the 23rd century.
Yeah.
Like, are they living like we are today? Are they, you know what I mean? Using
They just have cell phones instead of no technology. Cell phones are so primitive to what's considered, you know, the norm in that century that, that could be it.
And also, what was the learning curve for her stepping into Starfleet, where you all of a sudden you have to interface with this you know, top of the line technology?
And what sacrifice did she make to follow the path? How did she get introduced to the path that she followed? What was it that made her want to step away from her background and into a life in Starfleet?
Right.
So much stuff.
Yeah, they got to where they would just they would have an episode where someone is on the planet with them, and they would just spit out a fact about that character, you know. But you don't get to spend any time with them.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, it's part of that, I think, is because it's prestige television now. They feel like they have to do these sort of, like, every episode has to be like the most important episode you've ever seen, which is not sustainable. Because
right.
But also, I think because of the shorter seasons, because they spend so much time making them, they feel like they're wasting time if the characters are just sitting around talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think as we were saying with filler episodes, some we like, some we hate, some we think are incredibly inconsistent. Like, you know, I think for me the one that stands out really would be Geordi's mom. I got Interface and TNG, but at least we got some kind of exposure to Geordi. Even though, again, I don't love that episode. And I think that one of the things I thought about writing for our book was, because I wrote a thing about, does canon matter? Because I'm kind of big about staying relatively consistent in universe. I mean, I'm not anal about it, but I like them to try to make it consistent. But at the same time, I was going to write one. I think I'm still going to write it, which is why when you move away from sometimes your own established canon, it actually makes for interesting episodes and interesting discussions. Hey, there you go. In the original series, for example, 1 week it takes them, they'll say, oh, it's going to take us, 6 months to get from here. Then in the very next episode, they go the same distance in like a day. It is so incredibly inconsistent, but it also makes it an interesting show because sometimes the warts and alls and imperfection makes it interesting. So I think sometimes the filler makes it interesting. As you guys are saying, if every week it's as Q called it, if it's the redoubtable Captain Riker every week and Picard is the same every week, it's a little boring. And even though I don't love the episode with Geordi, at least I found out he had a mom and dad who were both in Starfleet. And so I think that those kind of imperfections of some of the fillers, it just makes the show more well-rounded in a lot of ways. Yeah, right.
Before we finish up, though, I do want to give a shout out to me in an alternate dimension, who is probably on this podcast complaining about the 14th bottle episode of Strange New World season 2. I wish something would just happen already. They have all these. This show's packed with filler. Why do we have to do 25 of these? Because it would probably be the case, but maybe the grass is always greener on the other side,
But Charles, I do think for you and me, that would be, you know how sometimes networks, well, not on the regular, I don't know about stream, but networks would take like TNG back in the day when the Spike TV, and they would grab all the data episodes and put them together. Sometimes that would drive me. I think for you and me, there's probably going to be a cut of Strange New Worlds. That's all the serious Explorer stuff, and then like the dancing
Four
and
of
stuff.
them.
And that's what we'll watch.
Now, the real test of this whole thing is not an immediate thing. It's going to happen in hindsight, and it's whether or not listeners consider this episode that we're recording right now a filler.
It's meta. It's really meta, right? Yeah.
Totally meta.
Right. All right. Well, Keith, where can people find more of you?
You can find me on Facebook, primarily the ESO Network Facebook groups.
And how about you, Alan?
CosmicCreative.com, KOZMIC Creative.com. Go check out my other podcast, which is Modern Musicology. We've got a lot of stuff going on. We just did an episode about 1975 a couple of weeks ago, and if you're old like me and you remember that year, go back and listen to that episode. And also my other podcast is Doctor Who Alton to Zygon, A to Z, where we are currently reviewing the current episodes of Doctor Who as they happen. So we just had one this week that we all particularly loved and had a great time discussing. So go check out that episode.
And how about us, Veronica?
Feltnerdy.com.
That's right. If you're in the Atlanta area, we've got a lot of shows coming up. If you enjoy our adult content, we have a show coming up this Saturday at the Red Light Cafe, which is a Star Trek themed adult Star Trek puppet show. We also have some family friendly stuff coming up. We have a couple of library shows. We're getting the details nailed down for right now this summer. And we're going to be at the Aurora Theater in Lawrenceville?
Yes.
On May 3rd.
Yep.
So follow Felt Nerdy across social media for our all ages stuff, and Felt Nerdy and Dirty for our adult content. And where else can people find us?
Monkeying Around, podcast about the monkeys.
That's right. And up next, we've got our interview with Dino from the New Monkeys. We just posted our Sandy Gimple episode. We've got some more fun stuff coming up too. So follow Monkeying Around. And Veronica, do you have a closing for us this week?
Take me out to the holosuite.
Perfect. I was going to say this episode is brought to you by Comcast.
Thanks, everybody.
See you next Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern.
And thanks, everybody.